Catherine and Steve.
Hi,
Today,
Peter.
Hello,
I
Dada.
hi. So today I take this honor to welcome you both to the 8th Eastern Milan National Forum 2020 and its first virtual edition to address a short talk on rewilding the economy through ecology. In Palipara Foundation, uh, we seek to tackle the problem of ecological conservation and human development through its principal Neseromics to redrawing the ancient ecology is economy paradigm for resilient and sustainable relationship between people and nature. For our Fisher, moving straight to the interaction, as you, Catherine, and Steve are being involved with the Foundation for the Real Fishes Livelihood Initiative and fungal assessment study across Northeast India. If you can share your experience on the uniqueness in the biodiversity of Northeast India. I mean, you guys have traveled the forest across the world. What is your views on the Northeast Indian forest and its biodiversity?
Yeah.
So Northeast India, the biodiversity is changes from altitude. So there's very different forests depending on where we are there. So there's the tropical and subtropical forests that we see on the plains, and there's some beautifully preserved forests in the national parks in Assam, like Holongapa and like Kaziranga, where we see a lot of biodiversity of trees, and because we see biodiversity of trees, we see biodiversity of fungi, yeah?
The fungi, mushrooms anyway, usually are the forests, you have a lot more biodiversity of trees and of fungi. So in old growth forests like Holongapa, you get a lot of variety of fungus there.
Mm. And similarly, as we go up in altitude, the forests of Meghalaya were incredibly biodiverse. The ones that had been preserved as sacred groves were incredibly biodiverse, as they are in the fauna and also the flora. So that was, for us, that was a real buzz, seeing forests that were in such pristine condition, and all credit to the people of Meghalaya for preserving those forests as sacred groves. And then we did actually go to Sikkim as well, to some of the high altitude forests, and again the very preserved forests at high altitude. The biodiversity of plants and fungi were quite extreme, like a carpet of fungus in those forests up there. The thing that we did find, and we continue to find, and it's interesting, we observed it in Northeast India, where we came upon compromised forests that had been not managed as well as they could be. The fungal biodiversity is also very poor. So you get both the plant biodiversity and the fungal biodiversity as being very poor. And also we did go to a regenerating forest on Majuli. Do you want to talk about that forest?
There was fungi there, but there's not a huge diversity of fungus on Majuli, on the forests that are being regrown there. That will probably change in the ensuing years. As the trees mature, then the fungus will mature with them and the biodiversity will increase, as it is with the animals at the moment, that as you plant the trees, then you get all of these animals in. Tigers, I think, are in there, and rare species of vultures and things like this. And as time goes by, then you get more different varieties of fungus turning up there as well. But for the moment, it's just a few species.
So I guess where the forests have been preserved and conserved, it's very exciting, that there's lots of diversity of plant, animal and fungus, which is useful on two levels. It's useful to the people who live on the forest fringe, and it's useful to the forest. because, you know, the more we study the biodiversity of forests, the more we realise that everything is connected. So when you walk into a forest, the inclination is to see the trees, and the plants, but in fact, you know, it's as important to think about what's below the ground, connecting it all, and that we only see, you know, mushrooms when they fruit. So, but, you know, in that ecosystem, everything is connected. And so if you're not managing the whole ecosystem, then you're compromising it not only for the forest itself, but then I suppose the progression of that is if people are living from the forest, then you're compromising it for that as well. But certainly in terms of biodiversity of fungi, in those forests that are well managed, like the sacred groves and like the high altitude forests that have been protected, we saw lots of fungi that potentially is of use to human beings. And yeah, so that biodiversity is very important into the future.
Thank you. I mean, I think it was very insightful, and I hope our viewers today would get an insight of the biodiversity of this region, who hasn't experienced it yet. Moving forward, to further have some insight to the Northeast India landscape and its social aspects for our audience, Steve, if you can share your perspective on the great diversity of indigenous communities in northeastern India and how they live, breathe, and celebrate nature.
Well, we've been in Northeast India, I think, 3 or 4 times now.
4 times.
4 times, and travelled through Nagaland, Arunachal, Assam, Meghalaya, I think that, and Sikkim. So travelled quite extensively, and in the tribal areas where the people have been living there for hundreds, maybe thousands of years in some cases, they're very much more connected to the land, and they tend to know the fungus that grows. So they know which ones are edible and which ones aren't. So they make use of fungus, whereas people who have just recently come in there, or city people, don't know as much about this as the tribal people or the local people that live there. So they're very much more in touch with nature. So they just have an intrinsic understanding that the forest is important, that you can't just destroy the forest and plant crops. It doesn't really work very well when you do that. Whereas if you keep parts of the forest and parts of the, you know, national parks, keep the animals, then everything fits together and works well, and you don't get the famines and the wild fluctuations that you might get otherwise.
Celebrated nature a lot.
Yeah, that all the local customs, that nature was very important, that they might worship the sun or the moon, but this was all to do with seasons. So it's all to do with the land and with growing things and with the way they fit into it. Whereas we tend to look at it now, the city people, you think of a forest as being a collection of trees and not a forest as a whole unit. And I think the tribal people more think of nature in terms of the whole nature rather than just individual components.
And I think the sacred groves were an example of where people regarded themselves as custodians of the land and the forests, rather than it being just something to be used.
Yeah, you look at yourself as a part of nature rather than nature just being a bunch of trees that you can cut down and get wood from, or a crop that you can make some food from. In the city we tend to think that this is, a crop is You don't need to anything apart from some dirt and some wheat seeds and you get wheat. Some rice seeds and you get rice. Well, you need a lot more than that, of course. And I think
Right.
the native peoples understand that.
Right. Yes, I mean it's very interesting and very encouraging, Steve, to hear your perspective on this. And we have been doing this fungi assessment across Northeast India since 2018 with you guys, and we are looking forward to doing more to get near to a conclusion, to finding and domesticating economically valuable fungal species. Fungi could be actually one of the potential non-timber forest produce, which can be a source of livelihood along with its all other health and ecological benefits. Catherine, if you can share your perspective on the scopes of Northeast fungi for livelihood, its perspective on research, cultivation, and harvesting of the wild fungi for livelihood.
So again, going back, it's kind of linked to the biodiversity of forests. So and the amount of edibles that are in a forest. So down on the plains in Assam, there were a few edibles in the forests down there, but not a lot. You know, they're like our tropical forests. There doesn't tend to be as many what we call ectomycorrhizal fungi, the fungi that is connected to the roots of trees, as there are in the higher altitude forest. So therefore, the prospect of cultivating changes. So on the plains, we saw some beautiful examples of villagers being able to grow an oyster-style mushroom in a very small building on their properties and being able to earn quite a lot of money from that. And that's something that's being adopted a lot over Asia, we see. And so the potential for that as a money earner for people, being able to grow the mushrooms that grow on wood on a very small plot of land and actually create a very marketable product from subsistence farming. It's fantastic, actually. And then the more that we test, the scientists come in and DNA test the forest fungi that we're finding in those tropical forests, the more fungi we'll find that's edible that can be grown in that way, you know, done in a little shack. It just needs spawn being able to be produced in a sterile environment. But it's very low tech, which is fantastic for villagers. But then as you get into those forests that we do in Meghalaya and in Sikkim, where there's quite a lot of edible ectomycorrhizal fungi. Now, those fungi are attached to the roots of the trees. So you can't grow them in a little shed on your property. They only grow in the forest because they and the trees are as one. So then what we see we saw in Meghalaya a little bit was people collecting that fungi for food in a very village basis. Occasionally we saw people who were collecting it and drying it, which is value adding to it, and then earning quite a lot of money for it at the marketplace. And then overseas, in other parts of Asia, we've seen that being done on a village basis, where if you took a small village like, the wonderful woman that we met, Kong, who is very knowledgeable about the forest fungi in her forest in Meghalaya, if, someone like her became a central point for people to bring their mushrooms to where there was a drying kiln, again, very low tech, then, that whole village could earn money from collecting wild mushrooms, value adding to it by drying it, which means that it prolongs the season, and then taking that to a market. And we know that in other parts of Asia, then it is also traded overseas in places where some of the fungi that we saw in Meghalaya and Sikkim actually fetches a very high price, like chanterelles in France or matsutake in Japan. They do actually collect a huge price for local villagers. So it can be a very sustainable industry. There is a little bit of research happening on how many of those mushrooms you can take from the forest and how many you need to leave to keep that fruiting of the mushrooms happening, so that it isn't over over harvested. But you know, certainly the examples that we've seen on a small scale in Northeast India and on a larger scale elsewhere in Asia, it's certainly something that could be very beneficial to the local people. But, and again, you know, that's where the science of doing surveys is so important, because then you find out, well, what is edible in those forests? And we certainly found species that weren't necessarily regarded as edible or medicinal in Northeast India, but we suspected were elsewhere. That could be another development on top of the knowledge that people have. So very viable, you know, mushrooms, you know, I think globally it's very zeitgeist at the moment. People are really starting to understand how, one, important mushrooms are to the ecosystem, but two, how beneficial they can be to human beings, and how the knowledge about that is very patchy across the world. But we have these little pockets where people are experts, and Northeast India is one of those where you've got hill tribe people who definitely know quite a bit about fungi.
I hope with our vision on the project, on this fungi project, we would do our best to incorporate our views, and should be able to incorporate a successful model on fungi cultivation as a livelihood opportunity for the rural communities. That's how we we bring back ecology into the economy. It's been a lot of learning always to interact with you guys. Thank you so much for joining us today for this session, and really appreciate your time for this. Looking forward to seeing you guys very, very soon.
Well, thank you. It's been a great learning for us too, working with the inspiring scientists from Balapara Foundation, but also the village people who became our experts on fungi, who knew far more about the local fungi than any of us. So it's been a great privilege to work with Balapara. Thank you for inviting us to do that, and for also inviting us to participate in this session.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure to come out. It's always a pleasure to come out to India. We enjoy it very much.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.